Three children emerged from the woods on a freezing November morning in 1971, their clothes torn, their feet bleeding, their eyes hollow with unspeakable terror. The oldest, 12-year-old, Sarah Whitmore, carried her 5-year-old brother Daniel on her back while clutching 9-year-old Emma's hand. When Deputy Frank Morrison found them stumbling along Route 47 in rural Harlan County, Kentucky, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Carved into Sarah's forearm were the words, "We escaped." The children hadn't been reported missing, no Amber Alert existed, no frantic parents searched for them. When authorities finally traced their origin to a remote property 15 miles deep in the Daniel Boone National Forest, what they discovered in that compound would spark the largest criminal investigation in Kentucky history, expose a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of county government, and reveal that these 3 children were just the survivors. 8 others never made it out alive. Harlan County, Kentucky, in 1971, was a place where the Appalachian Mountains kept secrets. The coal mines had been dying for a decade, leaving ghost towns scattered across the hollows like forgotten prayers. Poverty carved deep lines into the faces of families who'd worked these mountains for generations. It was the kind of place where people minded their own business, where a man's property was sacred, and where asking too many questions could get you hurt. The region had earned its reputation during the coal wars of the 1930s. Bloody Harlan, they called it, when miners fought company thugs and the National Guard in pitched battles over union rights. By 1971, that fighting spirit had curdled into something darker, a deep suspicion of outsiders, a bone-deep distrust of government authority, and a willingness to look the other way when neighbors did strange things behind closed doors. Route 47 wound through this landscape like a snake, connecting the dying town of Evarts to the even smaller community of Bledsoe. The road was poorly maintained, full of potholes that would swallow a tire whole. Dense forest pressed in from both sides, eastern hemlock and white pines so thick that even at noon, the road existed in perpetual twilight. It was along this stretch of forgotten asphalt that Deputy Frank Morrison made his morning patrol on November 18, 1971. Morrison was 53 years old, a Korean War veteran who'd seen combat at Chosin Reservoir. He thought nothing could shock him anymore. He was wrong. The temperature that morning had dropped to 28 degrees. A light snow had fallen overnight, dusting the mountains in white. Morrison had his heater running full blast, his coffee thermos wedged between his legs, his mind on the Thanksgiving turkey his wife Ellen was already planning to cook. He was thinking about whether they could afford to invite his brother's family when he saw them. 3 small figures stumbled along the shoulder of the road, moving like broken dolls, their movements jerky and uncoordinated. Morrison hit his brakes so hard his coffee spilled across his lap. He didn't feel the burn. The oldest child, he would learn her name was Sarah, turned to face his cruiser. Her face was gaunt, cheekbones sharp as knives, eyes sunken deep in their sockets. She wore what had once been a blue dress, now torn and filthy, hanging off her skeletal frame. No coat, no shoes. Her feet left bloody prints in the thin snow. The boy on her back appeared unconscious or dead, his small head lolling against her shoulder. The middle child, Emma, swayed on her feet like a tree about to fall. Morrison later told investigators that in that moment, looking at those 3 children, he felt like he was back in Korea, staring at refugees fleeing the Chinese advance. That same hollow-eyed look of people who'd seen hell and barely escaped. He radioed dispatch before he even got out of his vehicle. His voice, recorded on the station logs, was shaking. "I've got 3 children on Route 47, mile marker 15. Juveniles, severe condition. Send ambulance immediately. Repeat, send ambulance immediately." Sarah Elizabeth Whitmore was 12 years old, though she looked 8. Malnutrition had stunted her growth, leaving her barely 4 feet tall. When doctors at Harlan R Hospital examined her that first day, they found she weighed 52 pounds. A healthy 12-year-old girl should weigh between 80 and 100 pounds. But it wasn't the physical condition that haunted the medical staff. It was her eyes. Nurse Patricia Helton, who'd worked pediatrics for 20 years, would later testify that Sarah had the eyes of someone who'd lived 1,000 terrible years. When the doctors tried to separate her from her siblings, Sarah fought with animal ferocity, scratching and biting until they sedated her. Sarah had been born in 1959 in Harlan County, the daughter of Robert and Martha Whitmore, or so everyone assumed. The truth was far more complicated. Her birth certificate was a forgery. Her parents' names were aliases. Everything about Sarah Whitmore's identity was built on lies. Lies that would take investigators years to unravel. Emma, Grace Whitmore, 9 years old, hadn't spoken a single word since Deputy Morrison found her. Not in the ambulance, not at the hospital, not during the first 3 weeks of her recovery. She weighed 38 pounds. Her medical examination revealed healed fractures in both arms, 3 broken ribs that had mended incorrectly, and evidence of systematic beatings over years. The child psychologist brought in to evaluate her, Dr. Leonard Kaufman from the University of Kentucky, noted in his initial assessment, subject exhibits symptoms consistent with severe psychological trauma, responds to external stimuli with hypervigilance, startles at sudden movements or sounds, appears to expect violence at any moment, trust indicators absent, prognosis guarded. Dr. Kaufman had worked with traumatized children before, victims of abuse and neglect. He'd never seen anything like Emma. She wouldn't make eye contact. She'd only eat if her food was tested first. She slept sitting up, back against the wall, eyes half open. She was waiting for something terrible to happen. She knew it always did. Daniel Thomas Whitmore, 5 years old, remained unconscious for the first 36 hours after admission. The hypothermia nearly killed him. His core body temperature when he arrived at the hospital was 89 degrees, just 5 degrees above the point where the heart stops. The emergency room doctor, Dr. Raymond Pierce, later testified that it was a miracle the boy survived at all. When Daniel finally woke up, he asked for his mother, not the woman investigators would later identify as Martha Whitmore, but another woman, a woman he called Mama Ruth. He asked for her over and over, growing increasingly agitated until nurses sedated him again. Daniel's body told its own horror story. Scars crisscrossed his back in a pattern that forensic pathologist Dr. Alice Manning immediately recognized. Deliberate, systematic whipping. Some scars were old, faded to white lines. Others were newer, still pink and raised. Someone had been beating this child regularly for years. But there were other marks too, burns, small circular burns on his arms and chest. Dr. Manning measured them carefully, 3/8 of an inch in diameter, the exact size of a cigarette. Sheriff Thomas Welch received the call about the children at 7:45 a.m. He arrived at the hospital by 8:30, still wearing his church clothes from the early service he'd attended with his wife. Welch was 61 years old, a career lawman who'd been Harlan County Sheriff for 16 years. He ran a clean department in a dirty county, and everyone knew it. When he walked into the pediatric ward and saw those 3 children hooked up to 4S, wrapped in heated blankets, their small bodies looking even smaller against the hospital beds, something broke inside him. Welch had 4 grandchildren of his own. He looked at Sarah, Emma, and Daniel and saw his own grandkids. Then he looked closer and saw something else. Victims of a crime so monstrous his mind initially refused to accept it. The carving on Sarah's arm, "We escaped," had been done recently, probably within the last 48 hours. It wasn't a professional tattoo or even a crude prison-style inking. Someone had used a knife or sharp object to literally carve the letters into her skin. The cuts were deep enough to scar permanently, but controlled enough to avoid major blood vessels. Whoever did it knew anatomy, knew how to inflict maximum pain while minimizing the risk of death. "Who did this to you?" Welch asked Sarah gently. He sat beside her bed, his voice soft, his weathered face full of grandfatherly concern. Sarah looked at him for a long moment. Then she said something that would echo through the investigation for months. "The family did it. We all belong to the family, but we're not supposed to leave. Ever." Welch felt his skin crawl. "What family, sweetheart? Your mother and father?" "No." Sarah's voice was flat, emotionless. "The family, all of us, the children, the chosen ones. We live for the purpose." But Danny got sick, really sick, and they said he'd fulfill the purpose early. I knew what that meant. I'd seen them take others away when they fulfilled the purpose. They never came back. Sheriff Welch tried to keep his face neutral, but his heart was pounding. How many others, Sarah? How many other children are there? Sarah's eyes filled with tears for the first time. There were 11 of us. Now there's 3. The others already fulfilled the purpose. Welch stepped out of the room and immediately called the Kentucky State Police. Whatever this was, it was bigger than his small department could handle. Within 2 hours, state investigators descended on Harlan County. Within 4 hours, a forensic team was assembled. Within 6 hours, a command center was established at the county courthouse. The lead state investigator was Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb, a 20-year veteran of the Kentucky State Police with a reputation for solving complex cases. Webb had worked kidnappings, murders, organized crime. He listened to Sheriff Welch's briefing with growing alarm, then listened to the recording of Sarah's initial statement. When it ended, he sat in silence for a full minute. "We need to find where they came from," Webb finally said. "We need to find it today. If there are other children out there, they might not survive another night." But finding the origin point proved harder than anyone expected. Sarah could describe the compound in detail, the buildings, the layout, the surrounding forest, but she had no idea where it was. She'd been taken there as a small child and never left. She didn't know what county they were in, didn't know what state. The children had been kept completely isolated. Deputy Morrison retraced his route, looking for any indication of where 3 children might have emerged from the forest. The problem was that Route 47 ran through 15 miles of unbroken wilderness. The children could have come from anywhere. They'd been walking for hours before Morrison found them, according to Sarah, maybe as long as 8 or 9 hours through the freezing night. A search and rescue team assembled that afternoon. State police, county deputies, local volunteers, and 2 tracking dogs borrowed from the state prison system. They started from where Morrison had found the children and worked backward, the dogs following the faint scent trail through the forest. The terrain was brutal. Steep hillsides, dense undergrowth, rocky outcroppings that could break an ankle. The temperature dropped as afternoon turned to evening. Snow began falling again, heavier this time, threatening to erase whatever trail existed. At 6:47 p.m., just as Lieutenant Colonel Webb was about to call off the search until morning, one of the tracking dogs started barking frantically. The handlers followed the sound to a small creek, nearly frozen over. There, caught on a branch overhanging the water, was a scrap of blue fabric. Dr. Manning examined it later and confirmed the fabric matched Sarah's dress. They were on the right track. The search team pushed forward with renewed urgency, following the creek upstream. The forest grew thicker, darker. Ancient trees towered overhead, their branches interlocking to block out what little light remained. One of the volunteers, a local man named Jessup Carey who'd hunted these woods for 40 years, said something that made everyone stop. "I didn't even know this hollow existed. I've hunted every inch of these mountains and I've never seen this place." At 8:15 p.m., the dogs led them to a crude fence made of saplings lashed together with wire. Beyond the fence, barely visible through the trees and falling snow, were buildings. The compound sat in a natural bowl, surrounded on 3 sides by steep hillsides. A single dirt road provided access, but it was so overgrown it was barely passable. Someone had deliberately chosen this location for its isolation. Someone who wanted to be invisible. Lieutenant Colonel Webb called for backup and established a perimeter. Nobody would enter the compound until morning, when they could see what they were dealing with. The entire area was now a crime scene. That night, as snow fell steadily on Harlan County, 20 state troopers, 15 deputies, and a dozen FBI agents who'd been rushed in from the Louisville field office surrounded the compound. Nobody slept. Everyone knew that when the sun rose, they were going to see something terrible. They had no idea how terrible. Dawn broke gray and cold on November 19, 1971. Lieutenant Colonel Webb led the tactical team into the compound at 7 a.m., moving slowly, weapons drawn, expecting resistance. They found none. The compound was abandoned. Whoever had lived there was gone. But what they left behind would haunt every person who saw it for the rest of their lives. The main structure was a two-story farmhouse, old but sturdy, probably built in the 1920s, white paint peeled from weathered clapboards. Several windows were broken, covered with plastic sheeting. A stone chimney rose from one end, cold now, no smoke. Webb and his team entered through the front door. The interior was dark, lit only by flashlights cutting through the gloom. The smell hit them immediately: unwashed bodies, human waste, rot, and something else underneath, something chemical and wrong. The main room had once been a living room. Now it was something else entirely. The walls were covered in writing, floor to ceiling, written in what appeared to be blood. Scripture verses, biblical quotes, but twisted, perverted into something dark. "Suffer the little children to come unto me, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven, and in suffering they shall be purified. The innocent shall be sacrificed that the guilty may be saved. Blood washes clean, pain brings wisdom, death delivers grace." In the center of the room stood a crude wooden chair with leather straps attached to the arms and legs, the punishment chair. Investigators would later learn from Sarah. Children were strapped there for hours, sometimes days, for infractions real or imagined. But the real horror was downstairs. A narrow staircase descended into darkness. Webb's flashlight beam revealed stone walls, earth floor, support beams holding up the house above. The basement was larger than the footprint of the house itself, extending back into the hillside like a mine shaft. The first room contained 12 sleeping pallets on the floor, thin mattresses on bare earth, each with a single threadbare blanket. This was where the children slept. Names were scratched into the stone wall above each pallet: Sarah, Emma, Daniel, Rebecca, Joshua, Matthew, Rachel, Leah, Samuel, Benjamin, Abigail, Caleb. 11 names. Sarah had said there were 11 children originally. The second room contained shelves lined with canning jars. As Webb's flashlight played across them, one of the state troopers behind him suddenly turned and vomited. The jars didn't contain food. They contained biological specimens preserved in formaldehyde. Small organs, recognizable as human, recognizable as belonging to children. The third room was worse. It was a surgical theater, crude but functional. A metal table in the center, straps attached, drain underneath, surgical instruments laid out on a nearby tray, scalpels, forceps, bone saws, all used, all unwashed, dried blood still visible on the steel. On the wall, preserved in frames like diplomas, were photographs. 8 children, different ages, different stages of growth. Each photo showed a child on that table. Some were alive in the pictures, eyes wide with terror. Others were clearly dead, their bodies opened, their insides visible. Webb had to step outside. This 20-year veteran, this man who'd seen the worst humanity had to offer, had to step outside and breathe cold mountain air before he could continue. The FBI crime scene specialists who arrived later that morning worked in rotation, nobody able to spend more than 30 minutes at a time in that basement. They photographed everything, catalogued everything, collected everything. The evidence painted a picture of systematic torture and murder spanning years. But who was responsible? Who had done this? The answer started to emerge as investigators searched the rest of the compound. The second building was a workshop, tools, woodworking equipment, a generator, but also printing equipment, fake ID materials, birth certificate blanks, social security card templates. Whoever operated this compound had the capability to create false identities. The third building was living quarters, separate from where the children were kept. Comfortable furnishings, a full kitchen, heat, electricity from the generator, 2 bedrooms, both showing signs of recent occupation. In one bedroom, men's clothing. In the other, women's clothing. A husband and wife team, investigators theorized, operating this nightmare together. In a locked drawer in the bedroom dresser, they found documents. Birth certificates for 11 children, all bearing the surname Whitmore, all issued by a complicit or fooled clerk in Harlan County. Medical records, hand-written, documenting experiments, and a journal. The journal was written in a neat, careful hand. It documented everything: the acquisition of the children, Some purchased from desperate families, some stolen, some born to women who'd been brought to the compound and kept prisoner. The training methodology, the experiments, and the purpose. The journal's author, a man who identified himself only as the shepherd, believed he was doing God's work. He believed that children, being innocent, could serve as conduits for spiritual energy if properly prepared. He believed that their suffering opened portals to divine wisdom. He believed that their sacrifice could absolve the sins of others. He was performing human sacrifices, children's lives offered up in exchange for spiritual enlightenment and the salvation of adult souls. He'd been doing it for at least 12 years, according to the journal entries, and he hadn't worked alone. The journal mentioned others, the believers he called them, people who came to the compound, people who paid money, people who participated in the rituals. The journal didn't list their names, but it hinted at their positions. The judge attended tonight's ceremony. The sheriff's payment received. The businessman brought a generous offering. Lieutenant Colonel Webb sat in that bedroom reading the journal with growing horror. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just one madman operating in isolation. This was a network, a conspiracy, and it reached into the heart of Harlan County's power structure, which explained why the compound had operated undiscovered for so long. Someone had been protecting it. The investigation exploded outward like a bomb. Within 48 hours, FBI agents had taken over the entire operation. Within a week, federal prosecutors from Washington, D.C. arrived. Within 2 weeks, the first arrests were made, but not the arrests everyone expected. The shepherd and his wife had vanished. The compound had been abandoned at least 24 hours before the children escaped, based on the evidence. Somehow they'd known it was over. Somehow they'd been warned. The first person arrested was County Clerk Donald Pressman, 64 years old, a fixture in Harlan County government for 30 years. Pressman had signed off on all 11 fake birth certificates. He claimed he'd been fooled, but forensic document analysis proved otherwise. The certificates were too perfect, too consistent. Pressman had known exactly what he was creating. Under interrogation, Pressman broke. He'd been paid $500 per certificate, more than his monthly salary. He'd told himself he was just filing paperwork. He'd never asked what the children were for. He'd deliberately never asked. The second arrest was Deputy Walter Keene, 38 years old, a 7-year veteran of the Sheriff's Department. Keene had been making regular patrols past the access road to the compound for years. He'd never reported it. He'd never investigated it, because he'd been paid not to see it. Keene's arrest shook the department to its core. Sheriff Welch personally supervised the interrogation, his face white with fury. Keene admitted he'd received $300 a month in cash, left in a dead drop on his patrol route. He claimed he didn't know what was happening at the compound. He thought it was just marijuana growing or maybe bootlegging. Nothing serious. Nothing worth risking his job over, but the investigation kept digging deeper. Bank records were subpoenaed. Financial transactions traced. The money trail led to a trust account managed by Hamilton Savings and Loan in downtown Evarts. The trust account received regular deposits from 6 individuals. 3 were local businessmen. 1 was a doctor, 1 was a lawyer, and 1 was County Judge Mason Crawford. Judge Crawford, 70 years old, had presided over Harlan County Judicial Court for 23 years. He was respected, even beloved. He'd sent criminals to prison and presided over adoptions. He'd married young couples and settled estate disputes. He was a pillar of the community. He was also a member of the family. When FBI agents arrived at Judge Crawford's home on December 3, 1971, they found him in his study with a .38 revolver in his hand. He'd shot himself through the roof of the mouth, dead before he hit the floor. They found photographs in his desk drawer, photographs of Judge Crawford at the compound, photographs of ceremonies, photographs of children on that metal table in the basement. Judge Crawford wasn't just a financial supporter, he'd been an active participant. The community reeled. How could this happen? How could a respected judge, a man who'd lived among them for decades, be part of something so evil? The cognitive dissonance was too much for many to bear. People refused to believe it. They insisted the FBI was lying, that this was a government conspiracy, that Judge Crawford had been framed. But the evidence was overwhelming. 3 of the other 5 people connected to the trust account were arrested. All 3 initially denied involvement. All 3 eventually confessed to varying degrees of participation. They'd believed they were part of a religious movement. They'd believed the shepherd had divine insight. They'd believed the children were willing sacrifices, volunteers for a greater purpose. The psychological manipulation had been profound. The shepherd had exploited their religious beliefs, their desire for meaning, their fear of death and damnation. He'd convinced them that by participating in these rituals, they were ensuring their own salvation, that the suffering of innocent children could purchase spiritual enlightenment for guilty adults. It was twisted theology, a perversion of Christianity mixed with elements of occultism and pure psychopathy. But it had worked. For 12 years it had worked. The 2 remaining members of the conspiracy fled before they could be arrested. One, a local doctor named Herbert Lansing, was found 6 months later in Mexico. The other, a businessman named Robert Fallon, was never found, presumed dead or living under a new identity somewhere beyond the reach of American law. But the biggest fish remained free, the shepherd and his wife. The FBI launched a nationwide manhunt. Photos were distributed to every law enforcement agency in the country. Interpol was notified. Border crossings were monitored. But the shepherd had planned well. He had resources, connections, and a head start. Lieutenant Colonel Webb became obsessed with finding him. The case consumed his life. He tracked every lead personally, followed every tip, pursued every possibility. He traveled to 12 states in 6 months, always arriving just days or weeks too late. The shepherd was smart, careful, and had help. In April 1972, 5 months after the children were found, Webb got his closest lead. A motel clerk in Gallup, New Mexico, recognized the shepherd's photo. He'd checked in 3 days earlier with a woman matching the description of his wife. They'd paid cash, used fake names, but the clerk was certain. Webb arrived in Gallup within 8 hours. The couple was gone. They'd checked out that morning, heading west, but they'd left something behind in the trash, a newspaper clipping about the investigation with certain names circled. People who'd testified. People who'd cooperated with authorities. The shepherd was keeping track, and Webb realized with growing dread that the shepherd wasn't just running, he was planning something. The warning went out to everyone involved in the case. The shepherd might attempt revenge. Extra security was provided for key witnesses. County Clerk Pressman was moved to protective custody. Sheriff Welch started carrying his service weapon everywhere, even to church. But in the end, the shepherd's revenge came from an unexpected direction. On June 12, 1972, 7 months after the children were found, Sarah Whitmore woke up screaming in her foster home. She'd had a nightmare, but it wasn't just a nightmare, it was a memory. Sarah remembered something she'd suppressed. She remembered the shepherd's real name. She remembered because she'd heard one of the believers use it, Judge Crawford, during one of the ceremonies. He'd called the shepherd by name, a name Sarah had pushed deep down into her subconscious, because knowing it felt dangerous. Dr. Kaufman, the child psychologist still working with Sarah, immediately notified authorities. Sarah gave them the name James Cartwright. The FBI ran the name through every database. They found 17 James Cartwrights in the United States. They investigated all 17. 16 were cleared immediately. The 17th was promising James Robert Cartwright, aged 47, originally from Bell County, Kentucky, just north of Harlan County. Cartwright had been a medic in World War II. He'd received training in battlefield surgery, trauma medicine, and emergency procedures. After the war, he'd attended nursing school on the GI Bill but never finished. He'd worked as an orderly in several hospitals before being fired from a Lexington facility in 1957 for inappropriate conduct with patients. After 1958, James Cartwright disappeared from official records. No tax returns, no employment records, no documentation. He'd gone completely off the grid right around the time the compound in Harlan County had been established, but the breakthrough came from his military records. Cartwright had listed his wife as his emergency contact, Helen Margaret Cartwright, maiden name Dodd. The FBI found Helen's family in Bell County. They found her sister, Margaret Dodd Hensley. Margaret hadn't seen her sister Helen in 15 years. Helen had married that crazy medic James back in 1952, and the family had cut off contact after Helen started talking about James's divine mission and his conversations with angels. Margaret thought her sister had joined some kind of cult. She'd been right. But Margaret provided something invaluable, a photograph. Helen and James on their wedding day 1952, young and smiling, no hint of the monsters they'd become. The FBI now had confirmed faces to go with the names. The manhunt intensified. In September 1972, a bank teller in Portland, Oregon, thought she recognized Helen Cartwright trying to cash a check under a false name. She called police. By the time officers arrived, Helen was gone. But she'd been sloppy, left fingerprints on the counter. The FBI confirmed Helen Cartwright was in Portland. A task force descended on the city. For 2 weeks they searched every hotel, motel, boarding house, and rental property. They found nothing. Then, on September 28th, a traffic cop pulled over a car for running a red light. The driver provided ID, Michael Henderson. But when the officer ran the license plate, it came back stolen. The officer called for backup. As he waited, he looked more carefully at the driver. Something about his face was familiar. The officer had seen the FBI wanted posters. He drew his weapon and ordered the driver out of the vehicle. James Cartwright, the shepherd, was finally in custody. Helen was found in the passenger seat, trying to swallow a cyanide capsule. Officers stopped her in time. Both were arrested and transported to the Multnomah County Jail, where they were held without bail pending extradition to Kentucky. Lieutenant Colonel Webb flew to Portland that night. He arrived at the jail at 3 a.m. and went straight to the interrogation room, where James Cartwright sat handcuffed to a metal table. Webb later said that looking at Cartwright was like looking at ordinariness personified. He wasn't some wild-eyed fanatic. He was a middle-aged man with thinning hair and reading glasses. He looked like someone's accountant or a grocery store manager. He looked completely, utterly normal, which made what he'd done even more horrifying. Cartwright refused to speak without an attorney. Helen Cartwright, however, talked. She talked for 6 hours straight, and what she said chilled everyone who heard it. Helen believed everything James had told her. She believed the children were volunteers, souls who'd chosen before birth to serve this purpose. She believed their suffering was redemptive, that it purchased grace for others. She believed James was a prophet, chosen by God to perform a sacred duty. She showed no remorse, no guilt, no awareness that she'd participated in the torture and murder of 8 children. In her mind, she'd helped them fulfill their divine purpose. She'd set them free. The psychiatrists who examined Helen later declared her legally sane but morally insane, someone whose entire ethical framework had been so warped by years of indoctrination that she could no longer distinguish right from wrong. James Cartwright never spoke publicly about his motives or beliefs. He maintained absolute silence throughout the legal proceedings, refusing even to enter a plea. His court-appointed attorney entered a not guilty plea on his behalf. The trial was scheduled for March 1973. The trial of James and Helen Cartwright became a media sensation. News crews from across the country descended on Harlan County. The courthouse couldn't accommodate everyone who wanted to attend. A lottery system was established for the limited public seating. The prosecution, led by Kentucky Attorney General William Pierce with assistance from federal prosecutors, built their case methodically. They presented the physical evidence from the compound. They showed the photographs, the journal entries, the surgical instruments. They brought in forensic pathologists who testified about the remains found in those jars, and they brought in Sarah Whitmore. Sarah was 13 now, still small for her age, but stronger. She'd spent a year in intensive therapy with Dr. Kaufman. She'd slowly, painfully learned to trust again, to believe that not all adults were monsters, that she was safe. Taking the witness stand in front of James Cartwright was the hardest thing she'd ever done. Dr. Kaufman was in the courtroom for support. Sheriff Welch sat in the front row. Sarah's foster parents, John and Patricia Morrison, yes, Deputy Morrison and his wife had adopted Sarah, sat beside the sheriff. Sarah testified for 3 hours. She described life in the compound, the daily routine of work and prayer, the punishments for minor infractions, the ceremonies where the believers came and children were taken to the basement. She described hearing screams. She described the morning she found Rebecca's pallet empty and knew her friend had fulfilled the purpose. She described 8 friends who disappeared one by one. She described the night Daniel became sick with fever, how James Cartwright examined him and declared he was ready to fulfill the purpose early, how Sarah knew she had only one chance to save her brother and sister, how she'd stolen a kitchen knife and used it to carve "We escaped" into her own arm, because she knew if they were found, they needed people to understand they'd been held prisoner. How she'd waited until deep night, when James and Helen were asleep, and led Emma and Daniel up from the basement, out through a window she'd been slowly loosening for weeks, and into the forest with no idea where they were going or if they'd survive. The courtroom was silent except for Sarah's voice and the sound of people crying. When the prosecution finished, Sarah looked directly at James Cartwright for the first time. He stared back, his face expressionless. Sarah said, "You told us suffering brought wisdom. You told us pain made us pure. You told us we were chosen. But you lied. You're not a shepherd. You're not chosen. You're just a man who hurt children because you could, because we were small and you were big. That's all you ever were." Then she stepped down from the witness stand and walked out of the courtroom with her head high. The defense presented an insanity plea. They brought in psychiatrists who testified that James Cartwright suffered from paranoid schizophrenia with religious delusions, that he genuinely believed he was on a divine mission, that he lacked the capacity to understand his actions were wrong. The prosecution's psychiatrists countered that Cartwright's meticulous planning, his creation of false documents, his financial arrangements, and his ability to evade capture for 10 months all demonstrated clear understanding of right and wrong. He knew what he was doing was illegal. He knew it was wrong. He did it anyway. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. They found James Cartwright guilty on 8 counts of first-degree murder, 3 counts of kidnapping, and 17 counts of felony child abuse. They found Helen Cartwright guilty on the same charges. Kentucky still had the death penalty in 1973. The jury recommended death for both defendants. Judge Harold Stevens, brought in from another county to ensure impartiality, sentenced James Cartwright to death by electrocution. He sentenced Helen Cartwright to death by electrocution. Before pronouncing sentence, Judge Stevens said something that was quoted in newspapers across the country: "You have committed acts of such profound evil that language fails to capture their enormity. You have taken innocence and destroyed it. You have taken childhood and murdered it. You have taken trust and perverted it beyond recognition. If there is a God, and I believe there is, then you will face his judgment after facing ours. May he have mercy on your souls, because this court has none." But the story doesn't end there. James Cartwright's execution was scheduled for November 1974. 3 weeks before the execution date, he was found dead in his cell at Kentucky State Penitentiary. He'd fashioned a noose from torn bedsheets and hanged himself. He left no note, no final statement. He simply erased himself. Helen Cartwright's death sentence was commuted to life without parole in 1976, when the Supreme Court temporarily suspended capital punishment. She remained in the Kentucky Correctional Institute for Women until her death from pancreatic cancer in 1993. She never renounced her beliefs. To the end, she insisted she'd done nothing wrong. The 3 surviving children, Sarah, Emma, and Daniel, faced long roads to recovery. Daniel, the youngest, adapted most quickly. At 5, his memories of the compound faded faster. He was adopted by the Morrison family along with Sarah. He grew up to be a social worker, specializing in helping children who'd experienced trauma. He lives in Lexington today, married with 3 children of his own. He rarely gives interviews but has said that his sisters saved his life, and he spends every day trying to honor that gift by helping others. Emma never fully recovered her ability to speak. Deek. E-trauma had damaged something fundamental, but she learned sign language and became an accomplished artist. Her paintings, dark, haunting, beautiful, have been displayed in galleries across Kentucky. She lives in a group home with round-the-clock support, surrounded by people who care about her. She is safe, she is loved, and in her art, She found a voice that words could never provide. Sarah became a lawyer. She graduated from the University of Kentucky Law School in 1984 and immediately began working in victims' rights advocacy. She helped establish the Kentucky Children's Advocacy Center and served on the board of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. She argued 2 cases before the Kentucky Supreme Court regarding children's testimony in abuse cases. She won both. In 1995, Sarah published a memoir, We Escaped, a survivor's story. The book became a bestseller and was eventually adapted into a television movie. Sarah used the proceeds to establish the Whitmore Foundation, which funds therapy and support services for children rescued from abusive situations. Today, Sarah Whitmore Morrison is 66 years old. She still practices law in Harlan County, the place where her nightmare happened and where her life was saved. She still lives in the house where Deputy Morrison and his wife raised her. She says she stays because running away would be letting the shepherd win. She stays because this is her home, and she refuses to let evil take that from her. The compound itself was burned to the ground in 1974 by order of the Kentucky State Fire Marshal. The land was purchased by the state and incorporated into the Daniel Boone National Forest. No marker indicates what happened there. The location is deliberately kept secret to prevent dark tourism. But everyone in Harlan County knows where it was. They know the hollow. They avoid it. Even hunters who've spent their lives in these mountains won't go there. They say the place still feels wrong, that you can feel the sadness soaked into the ground. 8 children died in that compound. Their names deserve to be remembered. Rebecca Ann Whitmore, age 10. Joshua Michael Whitmore, age 7. Matthew David Whitmore, age 9. Rachel Marie Whitmore, age 6. Leah Christine Whitmore, age 8. Samuel James Whitmore, age 7. Benjamin Paul Whitmore, age 5. Abigail Grace Whitmore, age 11. None of those were their real names. Their true identities were never determined. The Cartwrights kept no records of where the children came from. Those 8 children were buried in anonymous graves, their real names lost, their families never notified, never given closure. In 1975, a memorial was erected in the Harlan County Courthouse Square, a simple granite stone with 8 names, the names they were known by, even if they weren't the names they were born with. The inscription reads, "The innocent ones, taken too soon, remembered forever. May their sacrifice never be forgotten." Every November 18th, the anniversary of the day Sarah, Emma, and Daniel were found, people gather at that memorial. They leave flowers. They say prayers. They remember. Sheriff Thomas Welch retired in 1976. He said he couldn't look at his badge anymore without thinking of Deputy Keene's betrayal. He died in 1982, his faith in law enforcement shaken, but his pride in helping save 3 children undiminished. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb retired from the Kentucky State Police in 1985. He moved to Harlan County and spent his retirement as a volunteer with the Whitmore Foundation. He said he needed to do something positive after spending so many years immersed in darkness. He passed away in 2008 at the age of 79. Dr. Leonard Kaufman continued, working with traumatized children until his retirement in 2000. He pioneered new therapeutic techniques based on his work with Emma, Sarah, and Daniel. His textbook, Healing the Wounded Child, is still used in psychology programs across the country. In the acknowledgments, he wrote, "3 children taught me more about resilience, courage, and the unconquerable human spirit than I taught them about healing." This book is their gift to future survivors. The question that haunts everyone who knows this story is, how many other compounds exist? How many other James Cartwrights are out there, operating in isolation, hidden in remote places, protected by conspiracy and silence? We know of at least 3 other similar cases that were discovered in the years following the Whitmore case. A compound in rural Montana in 1978, another in the Ozarks in 1982, a third in northern Maine in 1987. The Whitmore case provided a template for investigators to recognize the signs, the patterns, the methodology. How many weren't discovered? How many children suffered and died in places that were never found? We'll never know. But because of Sarah, Emma, and Daniel, because of their courage on that freezing November morning in 1971, we know to look. We know the signs. We know that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious markers. Sometimes it hides in forgotten hollows, behind respectable facades, protected by people who should have protected the innocent instead. The Whitmore case changed how America treats child abuse. It led to mandatory reporting laws in Kentucky and eventually in 43 other states. It led to the creation of child advocacy centers nationwide. It led to improved training for law enforcement in recognizing signs of organized abuse. It led to inter-agency task forces specifically designed to investigate crimes against children. 3 children stumbling out of the woods, bloody and terrified, changed the world. This is their story. This is their legacy. This is why we remember, and this is why, 54 years later, we still say their names: Sarah Elizabeth Whitmore Morrison, Emma Grace Whitmore, Daniel Thomas Whitmore Morrison. They survived. Against impossible odds, they survived, and they made sure their 8 lost friends would never be forgotten. What county are you watching from? Have you heard of similar cases in your area? The Whitmore case reminds us that darkness can exist anywhere, but so can courage. Let us know in the comments what you think. What would you have done in Sarah's situation? How do we protect children today from predators who hide in plain sight? Please subscribe to this channel. Help us tell these stories. Help us remember the victims. Help us honor the survivors. Share this video. Let people know what happened in Harlan County in 1971. Let them know that evil is real, but so is heroism. That children can be more courageous than adults. That 3 small survivors defeated a monster and saved countless future victims by exposing his crimes. This is history. Dark history. The kind we don't like to remember. But we must remember. Because remembering is how we prevent it from happening again. Thank you for watching. Thank you for bearing witness. Thank you for honoring Sarah, Emma, Daniel, and the 8 whose names we speak: Rebecca, Joshua, Matthew, Rachel, Leah, Samuel, Benjamin, and Abigail. May their memory be eternal. May their courage inspire us. And may we never, ever look away when children need protecting. What state are you watching from? Have you heard other stories like this from your area? What do you think should happen to people who enable monsters like the Cartwrights? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if this story affected you, please hit that subscribe button and the notification bell. We tell the stories that need to be told, no matter how dark. See you in the next video.